Thank you, Rafa, for joining our show. We are honored to have you today with us.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And we would like to talk about your main interest and your main profession about the statistics, biostatistics. And in general, I mean, for people, when we say statistics, it's in best case scenario, it mean value, maybe plus minus some variation. But we know as a scientist that it is much more than that. I mean, if you can explain or tell us for non-scientific people, so to say, why should we care about statistics? I mean, what is in the statistics which makes it so important? We know that scientists, but I mean, if you can from statisticians or bioinformaticians standpoint, tell us what's so important.
Sure. So science 200 years ago, most of it was the scientists could make observations and create theories, test them, and the data was relatively simple. Sometimes it was just a matter of looking through a microscope and seeing something that was pretty convincing. But as time has gone by, more and more science disciplines depend on data that's somewhat complex. And the first examples of this were in probably the end of the 19th century. You started to have social scientists trying to describe populations with, like you said, averages and standard deviations instead of having to describe every single person. It turned out to be a relatively good way to summarize what was going on in society and make policy decisions that way. But a lot has happened since then. And now we've had very important parts of science that depend on what we call clinical trials or randomized controlled trials, where if you really want to know if some drug or some intervention works and you're ethically permitted to do it, you split populations at random and you give one the drug and the other group you don't. You give a placebo, and then you have statistical tools to tell you if the differences that you see are due to chance or are something maybe worth exploring further. So that's called hypothesis testing in statistics. So that's something that 40s, 50s that became an important part of medicine. And I think personally that medicine has improved a lot since randomized trials got introduced into medicine, because all of a sudden you remove biases from the people inventing the drugs or the people suggesting the interventions. But since then, even more things have become data dependent. In science, you have the weather is now more driven by fitting models to existing data than just mechanistic models developed from physics. That it's a combination of both now, and that's why weather predictions in some parts of the world are quite good. Then in another thing that has happened more recently, is that in biology, technologies have been invented where you can see things indirectly. Instead of looking through a microscope, you obtain data that indirectly tells you what's going on. And that data today is quite complex. You have, in some cases, you'll get like a billion little character strings coming from, say, the DNA. And that somehow needs to be converted into a picture or some kind of summary that the biologist doing the experiment can understand and can draw conclusions from or inspire new experiments. And converting that very complex data sets into what a biologist or a biomedical researcher can do is something quite complex, where you need expertise that aren't necessarily the expertise that biologists have. It's more statistical expertise, data analysis expertise, and today in the 20th century, computational expertise, because it's not as simple as you can't use a calculator anymore. You need to write code that can do that efficiently. So we've been transitioning in science to being more and more data driven, and as a result, statistics has become more and more important. And the beauty of statistics, in a way, is that some of the things we learned 150 years ago actually can still be used today. So that's why someone that studies statistics can work in many different fields, because the techniques that you learn, the ideas that you learn, the concepts that you learn, the way to think is applicable in many disciplines, even if it was discovered in, say, agricultural experiments many of the important ideas of statistics were actually developed for agriculture, and they're still
Yeah, well,
used today.
that was empirically. I mean, the people were just generating data, and then it was kind of in intellectual guess rather than the analysis. They are by their experience generating.
Sure, but then
knowledge.
but then in the 1920s, it became more formal, and experimental design was invented, and ways of analyzing that data efficiently was invented, and you could be more systematic, and it actually improved agriculture quite a bit. So that's I hope a overall view of how statistics has become more and more important.
Yeah, I think you touched upon a very important point regarding the clinical trials and importance of the statistics, and we know that under the normal conditions, I mean, the clinical trials are multi-center, placebo-controlled, double-blinded, randomized, etc. There are lots of requirements, and that takes a lot of time to validate and to assess the efficacy of the drug. But now in the corona time, so the things are changing, and now we can see that, I mean, in week time, all of a sudden, FDA or CDC recommends one drug based on like a dozen of the patients clinical trial. Next week they say, okay, there is another trial now available with 20 patients, and we have to switch it back. I mean, how in your opinion, I mean, this is the extraordinary condition now, and then basically the statistics, it's kind of losing its grip on the events. And what is your standpoint on that? Because we see it on regular basis, almost on the daily basis, this happening, right?
Yes. So what you're talking about I think is a more general problem. Now we're seeing it maybe a bit worse. It's being exaggerated or amplified because of the urgency for certain drugs and therapies to be examined. But I think what you're talking about is the fact that often the way that many papers or results that we think are true eventually turn out to be incorrect or falsified. Many times is because the data wasn't analyzed properly, or there was a statistical flaw. That's an unfortunate reality, and I think we're going to be in that reality for a while. But I think I also am an optimist, and I think it's getting better. And the way I see it is that you had too much of a dramatic and sudden change in many scientific fields, where people who were trained a certain way because the field was that's what was important in the field. They weren't necessarily trained in statistical thinking in some cases at all. I know that there's famous biologists that say that if you need statistics for analyzing your experimental data, it's a bad experiment. Now, a good experiment, you don't even need a statistician. I know it's like that was something I heard.
It should be obvious, right? So by looking on the data, you should see the difference. You don't need to reveal it with this mathematical formula, right?
So that's the mindset. And also look at medical school. I mean, how many medical schools require a formal statistics course as part of their curriculum? It's not something that's currently there. And then I don't want to single out anybody. It's just the general problem that education is catching up to this new reality, and it's a little bit slow because you have to convince people, you have to develop the courses. It's a slow sludge to get to the point where we're actually educating everybody in statistics in the way they need to. So what happens? So you have editors, reviewers that aren't necessarily experts in statistics. Statisticians were way too busy to review all these papers. So you end up with some of these falling through the cracks, maybe too many.
But now the best journals, they also require to submit the raw data, and then they do this kind of statistics. So
that's another avenue that I think is very it has great potential to improve things. Not just education is my number one approach to this. Everybody should become more literate in data analysis and statistics, but the other thing you can do is you can require people to make data and code public. That's sometimes not easy to do because the data has personal identifier, so it's not always easy. But in general, that should be our goal. And how does that help? The way that that helps is that if you put out the code and the data that you use to analyze your data in your paper, others can look at it, and not just the referees, but many others can look at it. Eventually, someone might get interested and starts looking
Yeah.
very carefully at it in a way that a referee doesn't have time to do. And by the way,
But you can say, Rafa, for us, for who are no statisticians, what you consider recent breakthroughs in your field, what could be landmark results, which really has a big influence.
so
I guess
there's
you mean
go ahead.
where the areas of the application where the statistics haven't been used before, and now it becomes very common, and it generates something new which hasn't been hidden from us before. Something in
So
that.
yeah, so there's two possible answers I can give you. One is in just the statistics field, but the other one would be in the application of statistics, where I think we're seeing more right now, more innovation that might have a big impact in the future. You see it in, I mean, one big change we've seen in the past few years is in journalism, where we have seen a shift to many more journalists using data to write their stories and to make their points. That's a big shift. It happened right before our eyes in the last 10 years. You have that's one. There's another one is in sports. Now every team in almost any sport is using data to develop their players, to select their players and develop strategies. That in basketball, for example, you have, I don't know if you've noticed it, but now everything is a dunk or a three-pointer. I don't know if everybody's a basketball fan, but that wasn't the case when I was a young man.
Sure.
That was a very different game. That's based on data. Somebody figured out that statistically that was the better strategy. It wasn't just because players got better at shooting three-pointers. So it's basically a probabilistic calculation that a good three-pointer, a good three-point shooter has a higher expectation of points than a good two-point shooter. So that's another one. I mean, there's any others. There's just the idea of using data for learning. So things like translators and spell checkers, those are now data driven. That's a much more advanced part of statistics. In fact, some people might not even say it's statistics, it's machine learning. But as I see it, if you're analyzing data and coming up with either new algorithms or new knowledge from the data, I put that all in the big bucket of statistics or applied statistics. But that's another way that we've seen a big change. The way that we use things like choosing what movie to watch, choosing what restaurant to go to, choosing what roads to go down. That's all data driven now. It's all applications of
Yeah,
data
this
analysis.
all we are using daily, right? Yeah. So you say that it depends also where it was applicable, where, right? It depends on field.
So
And
yeah,
you-
the field is that's what I would say is this
Yeah,
past a couple of decades, the big advance in statistics is how much it's being used in different fields, and it's not necessarily that we have an advancement in statistical methodology per se, but just in creative use of statistics. And I'm forgetting a bunch of things. I'm just giving you a few
Yeah.
examples.
It means
Uh,
that field should develop itself and find a way to be connected with you, right?
Yeah.
This is
Now, coming back to this pandemic time, I think we are also facing the statistical issues when we are every country, even every hospital generates the data, and these data, I mean, in many cases they are not comparable, they are not standardized, and then you see these numbers, and I mean, world is flooded with the corona infection rate, death rate, and then it turns out that it is calculated in different ways, etc., etc. So I think we are facing now in front of us the importance and significance, because that prevents us to draw the proper conclusion, right? I mean, can you comment on that? What is happening now in the period of pandemic with the data collection and the discrepancies and the ways the data are handled?
So first, I would say that I think it's a positive how much data has been available in this particular pandemic. I mean, that wasn't the case 20 years ago, right? Or if you go far back, the Spanish flu, there's no data. There's none. There's
just
so at least
mortality maybe.
so there's that's good. That's the fact that the data is being made public. It helps the plan. I mean, I'm sure we could have done better, but it's a good thing that it's all out there, and it's been a lot of it has been the work of independent groups, journalists and other data scientists have gotten together and made all this data available. Now, I think what you're talking about is the lack of another topic is the lack of standardization, and that's a hard challenge. And I mean that might be more of a bureaucratic challenge than a statistical challenge. Just getting people to agree to report things in the same way and
no,
in
my
hospitals.
point is that, I mean, how comparable? I mean, when people tend to compare, I mean, the different waves and the peaks and the plateaus and the dynamics of the virus in different countries and different settings. And in many cases, it feels that, I mean, the way data are obtained, that could influence the outcome of this analysis. Yeah. And then there are discrepancies, and that it's not that the virus itself it's acting differently in given situation, but simply that the data is collected indifferently.
And yeah, absolutely. That's happening in a bunch of different ways during these times, especially like the reported cases is different. Even deaths sometimes are reported differently. The calculations of the infection fatality rate is kind of all over the place because the denominator is the way they compute the denominator. The total number of cases is all over the place for many different reasons. So that's absolutely true. And I guess all I could say about that is that something that we know applied statisticians have always done is we work with we rarely work on our own when we analyze data. We work with experts that can tell us what the data. We put the data into context and tell us what knowledge is out there to incorporate into the analysis. Like if you're just analyzing data on your own without any contact and awareness of the context, you can make a lot of mistakes because it's not like you're pointing out. It's these totals mean different things because they were collected in this particular case, because the way they were collected, because they were defined. So yeah, if you work alone, you're much more prone to make mistakes. So maybe that is something that not everybody knows, but traditionally, statisticians, we've always, when we work on applications, we work with experts, we collaborate, and we inform ourselves about how to analyze data. It's something that shouldn't be done without context. And it's not just here, it's in other applications too. Yeah.
In every field. If we understand correctly, it means that alone statistic couldn't give you answer, and alone the experts could not. Only synergy can create.
Well, yeah, maybe, yeah. I mean, I think in the case of, say, the COVID predictions about how many people were going to get it and die, that I think most statisticians were just standing back and watching and wondering what's the uncertainty in all these estimates that are being thrown out there. We usually report both a point estimate and some kind of uncertainty estimate of how much it could have varied depending on stochasticity and natural variability and all these other things that we can't explain. So yeah, that was. I mean, we all were the statisticians I talked to. We all were wondering, like, how sure are they really about these predictions? And it turned out that a lot of them were certainly not as sure as they thought they were, just based on what eventually happened.
I will dream if we will have in our field as many data that we can do directly statistic, but one day, who knows, right? But we are using but all reconstructing of populations, DIMS, paleo-DIMS, you can do it. In genetics, it works well, paleogenetics, I mean. But hopefully it will work more and more in humanities too, right?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we are seeing it. We are seeing historians are using it a little bit, and in the literature, sometimes it's statistical techniques are used to, for example, predict who wrote a book. You definitely see it in journalism, as I mentioned earlier.
So the point is that, I mean, in biology, in for instance, the area you are working in genomics, you have thousands of data and gene expression patterns and the analysis and the connections and transcriptomics, proteomics, etc. And then you are analyzing using statistical tools to validate and to see the differences and the patterns, etc. And on the other hand, we are still the area where David is working, for instance, paleoanthropology. You have one, in best case scenario, piece of the bone, and that's all your working materials. Not even full specimen, but just fragment, and that's what you are exploring and drawing conclusion and modeling it. So, well, how shall we balance
one thing I will say is
two extremes from statistical standpoint? What is your opinion on that?
So, I mean, the first thing I would say is that not all fields are going to require or need statistics. That doesn't mean they're not valuable, obviously. So there's other ways to extract knowledge, to do science and discover things than analyzing data. I mean, we've done it for most of history. But what the other thing I would say is that you never know what's coming. Like, it could surprise you that all of a sudden this field that had no data all of a sudden becomes data rich. Biology is an example of that. Of all of a sudden it happens. So just don't be surprised if all of a sudden in your field you don't know what could happen. All of a sudden there's something, some new revolution occurs, or some new technique is invented that you all of a sudden are drowning in data. It could happen. So it's good to be ready.
Yeah. And then to conclude, I think to summarize what we have been talking now, I mean, statistics is the great tool, but at the same time, we need to use it properly in order to get best out of it. And I guess in the future, as you mentioned, not only in the biomedical field, but in many areas of the science, including agriculture or including any other even humanities fields, we will need more and more. And I think the education and, I mean, understanding of the importance of the statistics and statistical analysis and the power or data which you can obtain, to start teaching it, maybe even from at school level, not at even university, becomes very important.
Yeah, I mean, we do a lot to get kids to learn calculus. I mean, I think the entire high school curriculum is getting them ready for that eventually in college, because I guess, we needed it for astronomy 400 years ago. But today, it looks like being data literate and understanding statistical concepts may be more important to some. Of course, you need calculus for a bunch of stuff, but maybe others are better off learning stats. Now, the last thing I'll say, following up on your comment, is that it's a lot of people want to learn how to analyze data today for obvious reasons, but I would encourage you to learn statistics. There's a history of people analyzing data, and they've made a lot of mistakes on the way. They've developed some ideas that can be used again. And if you don't learn that stuff, you are very likely to either make the same mistake we've made in the past by not learning about them, or reinventing the wheels.
Wonderful. With this optimistic note, we will finish our conversation with you, Rafa. Thank you again for joining us. It was very educational and very interesting, and I hope to talk to you sometime later as well.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Bye.
Excellent.